There is a photograph taken in the autumn of 1987 that hangs in the offices of the Dry Cimarron Watershed Council, and most people who walk past it do not know what they are looking at. It shows a square of land from the air, roughly 40 acres, taken from a small plane chartered for a survey. The surrounding range is the color of old bone. Every pasture in the frame has the texture of a scorched doormat, cracked at the seams, the grasses long since hammered down to their roots by a drought that had been running 3 years without mercy. But one parcel in the lower left corner of the photograph is the wrong color entirely. It is green. Not bright or boastful green, but the quiet, dense, olive-gray green of established native grass carrying real moisture in its root systems. The kind of green that takes years to build and looks almost modest set against the catastrophe around it. There is no caption beneath the photograph, only a small brass plate screwed into the frame, and on that plate is a sentence in plain block letters. It says, "The water was always there." You only had to trust something older than your own opinion. Most people walk past it. This is the story of how that photograph came to exist, and of the woman who appears in it as a small, dark figure at the center of the green, standing beside a wooden stock tank, with one hand resting on the neck of a red steer and her face turned away from the plane as if she has no interest in being seen. Her name was Opaline Rourke. She was 62 years old in the spring of 1984 when she drove her late husband's flatbed truck 40 miles to a sale barn outside Clayton, New Mexico, and paid $50 apiece for 19 Hereford steers that were in such poor condition the auctioneer had been unable to sell them to a single other bidder through 2 full rounds. The steers were gaunt to the point of architectural visibility, their hip bones and shoulder blades pressing through their hides like furniture pushing through a canvas cover. Their eyes were dull and sunken. 3 of them had to be coaxed up a loading ramp with a rope because their legs trembled when asked to climb. The auctioneer, a man named Darvis Pruitt, who had been calling stock sales in Union County for 31 years, watched Opaline write the check and said to her in a tone that was genuinely, carefully kind, the way a doctor is kind when the news is not going to improve, that he hoped she understood she was buying animals that might not survive the trailer ride home. She tucked the checkbook into her coat. She said, "They will survive it." That was all she said. The drought had begun its serious work in 1982. The dry Cimarron country of northeastern New Mexico and the Oklahoma Panhandle is not land that forgives easily under normal conditions. The mesa tops run to sparse blue grama and side oats grama, good grass when it has moisture, brittle and punishing when it does not. The canyons hold juniper and cedar and, in certain spots, the ghost lines of old waterways that once ran reliably and now ran only after hard rain. By the spring of 1984, the region had received less than 9 inches of precipitation across 22 months. Ranchers who had carried 300 head were down to 60 or 70, selling into a collapsed market because they had no choice, hauling water in tanks on flatbeds because the windmills were pulling air. The ranching community was in a state of dignified emergency, which is to say that people were quietly losing everything while insisting in public that they expected a turn. Opaline had been a widow for 14 months. Her husband, Earl Rourke, had died of a cardiac event in January of 1983 while repairing a section of woven wire fence in the north pasture. He had been 59 years old. Their son, Martin, had moved to Albuquerque in 1979 to work in the petroleum permitting offices of a state agency. Their daughter, Clara, was in Amarillo with her husband and 2 young children. Neither of them had expressed a serious intention to return to the home place, a fact that had not been discussed directly by anyone in the family, but was present in every phone conversation, like a third party breathing on the line. The home place was 420 acres on the east side of a shallow mesa, bounded on the south by a two-track caliche road, and on the north by a dry arroyo that had not held surface water since 1979. The improvements were a low adobe house, a board and batten barn of considerable age, 3 working windmills that were by the spring of 1984 producing very little, and a network of plank-sided stock tanks that were either empty or holding a few inches of brackish water that the cattle, had there been cattle, would have accepted only in desperation. This is the question the photograph poses and does not answer. Why would a 61-year-old woman, recently widowed, operating a ranch alone during the 3rd year of a serious drought, spend $950 on 19 dying steers? Why bring more livestock onto land that was already struggling to carry none? What did she know, or believe she knew, that made this purchase something other than grief acting as financial decision? The answer was in a wooden box. Earl Rourke had kept a working journal for nearly 30 years. It was not a diary in any sentimental sense. It was a record. Precipitation amounts noted every morning with a rain gauge near the barn door. Grass height observations made by walking specific routes across specific pastures on the first day of each month. Soil condition notations, wind direction tallies during dry spells, and, woven through all of it, copies of observations made by his own father, Clement Rourke, who had homesteaded the same ground in 1908 and kept his own ledgers, which Earl had transcribed in full into his working journal before the originals were lost to a house fire in 1961. Clement Rourke had first broken ground on this property in an era when the region's water table and its relationship to the surface geology were not yet fully disrupted by the mechanical pumping that would come later. He had noted, in the plain handwriting of a man who had learned to write from a traveling teacher and saw no reason to ornament the skill, a number of things about the property's subsurface that later generations had largely forgotten. The most important of these was a notation made in September of 1909. Clement Rourke had written, "Found where the old Spanish had a well dug between the first and second rock shelf north of the canyon. Stone capped with fitted slabs, water at 11 feet and clear. Moved my camp there for the month. The grass in that near half-mile holds green 3 weeks past the rest, and I believe it is fed from below." Earl Rourke had been a thorough reader of his father's observations, and he had, in the late 1960s and early 1970s, made several attempts to locate what Clement had described. He had found a depression in the appropriate area and noted it twice in his journal, but the well itself had either shifted in his father's description or been buried further under the accumulated decades of soil movement and cedar encroachment, and Earl had never excavated it. The notation existed in the journal: North Canyon rim, first to second shelf. Old stone cap may still hold. He had written beneath it, "We'll come back to this when the drought turns." The drought he had been referring to was the dry spell of 1971 and 1972. He had not come back to it. Opaline had read the journal many times. She had read it the way a person reads a letter they have memorized, but continue to return to, not for new information, but for the feeling of the voice inside it. She had been reading it since December of 1983, through the winter after Earl died, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold beside her, following her husband's precise hand across 30 years of mornings on this same ground. She had read the notation about Clement's well in January, and had read it again in February and had begun in March to think about it seriously. And by the time she drove to the sale barn in April, she had spent 6 weeks reading the journal's landscape observations in a new light, tracking the relationship between the North Canyon pasture's performance in dry years and the performance of every other pasture. And the numbers were not ambiguous. In the 1953 drought and in the 1956 dry year and in the 1971 drawdown, the North Canyon pasture had held its grass color and its carrying capacity 3 to 4 weeks past the point where adjacent pastures collapsed. Earl had noted this each time and attributed it to a clay layer that retained moisture. He had not connected it to his father's well notation. Opaline had. She had also, in March, walked the North Canyon rim alone on a cold afternoon and found the depression her husband had written about, and found beside it 3 flat stones of the same pale limestone that made up the second shelf of the canyon wall, stacked against a cedar in a way that bore no resemblance to how water and time stack stones. They were fitted. They had been placed. She did not excavate them that afternoon. She went back to the house and made supper and read the journal again. The grass was always telling you, Clement had written in a different entry in August of 1912, during another brutal summer. The grass goes yellow where the water does not reach and stays itself where it does. You only have to watch long enough to understand what it is saying. She drove to Clayton the next morning and bought 19 steers. The spring of 1984 on the Rourke place was not a thing that the surrounding community observed with any degree of credibility. Opaline's nearest neighbor to the west, a man named Harlan Fitch, who ran a modest cow-calf operation on his family's section and a half, drove over on the second Saturday of May when word reached him that she had come home from Clayton with livestock. He found her in the north pasture driving steel posts with a manual driver. He was a man who had known Earl Rourke for 30 years and had considerable genuine regard for the family, and he expressed his concern in the careful, solicitous way of a man who believes he is about to watch someone he respects make a serious error. He said that the pasture she was posting would not carry those animals past July if the rains did not come, and that with all due respect, the purchase of more cattle during a drought of this duration and severity was the sort of thing a person did when grief had gotten ahead of good sense. He said this gently. He said he would be glad to take the steers off her hands for the $50 a head she had paid for them, or close to it, and she would not be down anything but the trucking. He stood with his hat in his hands in the early May sun and waited. Opaline drove another post. She said, "They are not going into this pasture, Harlan." She said, "They are going into the North Canyon pasture once I have the fence up." She drove another post. She said, "I have water for them." He looked at the windmill at the north end of the property, which had not been pulling reliably for 7 months, and he looked at the caliche dry ground and the sparse grass that was already thinning under the spring sun, and he told her, respectfully, that he believed she was mistaken about the water. He put his hat back on and drove home. That evening, he told his wife he was going to keep an eye on the situation because he was not certain Opaline was managing as well as she appeared to be. And his wife, who had known Opaline longer than he had, said that she thought Opaline was probably managing exactly as well as she appeared to be, and possibly considerably better. The county agricultural extension agent, a forthright younger man named Dennis Cordova, who had a graduate degree from New Mexico State and strong opinions about range carrying capacity, made a professional visit to the Rourke place in late May. He drove out as part of a drought response outreach that his office was conducting across the county, and he was courteous and thorough. and presented Opaline with a printed bulletin on emergency destocking strategies and an offer of assistance in locating buyers. He had data. He had charts showing the current range conditions index for her pasture classification and the projected precipitation shortfall for the coming summer based on the current La Nina pattern. He sat at her kitchen table and walked through the numbers and said that his best professional advice was to reduce her stocking to 0 for the balance of the drought, rest the range entirely, and focus her resources on maintaining the improvements so she could restock when conditions improved. He said it was entirely possible to save the ranch without the livestock if the decisions were made quickly. He was sincere. He was well-trained. He was reading from the correct data for every ranch in the county, except, as it would develop, this one. Opaline poured him a second cup of coffee. She thanked him for coming. She said, "I appreciate the visit, Mr. Cordova, I do. I'm going to try something different." He asked her what she was going to try. She said, "I'm going to find the water first." He looked at her with the measured patience of a man who has been trained to respect the autonomy of landowners, while also being trained to recognize situations that were unlikely to resolve well without intervention. And he wrote his office phone number on the back of the bulletin and left it on the table and said the offer stood. On the 1st of June, Opaline hired the only person who answered her notice on the board at the hardware store in Clayton. This was a woman named Eulalia Vasquez, who was 24 years old and had grown up in the village of Capulin, 20 miles to the south, and had spent most of her working life doing physical labor of various kinds, on ranches and in orchards, and one summer in a timber operation. She had answered the notice because it said the work involved digging and the pay was fair, and she had arrived in a truck that was older than she was, and shook Opaline's hand with the firm, appraising grip of someone who intends to know immediately whether the other party is serious. Opaline showed her the journal entry. Eulalia read it twice. She looked up and said, "So there is a well." Opaline said, "I believe so," Eulalia said, "and you think the grass is staying green because of it." Opaline said, "I know it is." Eulalia looked at the North Canyon pasture for a long moment, and then she said, "All right," and that was essentially the whole of their negotiation. They found the well on the 8th of June. It was at 11 feet and 3 inches, precisely where Clement Rourke had recorded it in 1909, on the shelf between the first and second outcropping of the canyon's north rim. The stone cap was 4 fitted limestone slabs, each one weighing somewhere between 80 and 100 pounds, set so tightly that a juniper that had grown in the intervening decades had rooted around them rather than through them. Below the cap, the water was clear. It was cold. It was a seep-fed well drawing from a small subsurface lens in the fractured limestone, the kind of formation that does not respond dramatically to surface drought because it is fed not by recent rain, but by slow percolation through several hundred feet of rock over many years. It was not a high-volume source. A measurement taken the following morning showed it recovering at roughly 40 gallons per hour, a modest number, nothing that would support a large operation, but enough, directed carefully through a gravity-fed line to a single concrete tank, to water 19 steers through a summer and keep the 30-acre pasture immediately above the lens in the condition Clement Rourke had described in 1909. Eulalia spent 3 days clearing the juniper and the accumulated soil from the area around the cap. She and Opaline spent 2 more days laying a buried line of black plastic pipe from the well to a concrete tank they poured in forms at the center of the North Canyon pasture. Opaline mixed the concrete herself in a rented drum mixer. The total cost of materials for the water system was $212. The steers went into the North Canyon pasture on the 15th of June. They were, by that point, in noticeably better condition than they had arrived in, because Opaline had been feeding them hay and a modest grain supplement through May while the fence was being finished. But they were still thin animals, and watching 19 thin animals walk into a dry-looking pasture in the third year of a drought was not a thing that inspired confidence in observers. Harlan Fitch drove past on the county road, which ran along the southern edge of the property on the afternoon the steers went in. He stopped and watched them for a while from his truck window. He drove home. He did not come back. The summer of 1984 was the driest of the 3 drought years. The precipitation record for the Clayton Weather Station shows 1.4 inches of rainfall between June 1st and September 30th of that year. The range across most of the dry Cimarron country went from poor to failed by mid-July. Several ranching families in the county made the final decision to liquidate their herds entirely and lease the land to neighboring operations at reduced rates until conditions improved. The Cordova family, whose place bordered the Fitch operation to the north, sold everything and listed the land for sale. A corporate land-buying entity from outside the state made an offer within 2 weeks at a price that, as Dennis Cordova's extension bulletin had predicted, did not reflect the land's value under normal conditions, but did reflect the seller's circumstances under these ones. Opaline's North Canyon pasture, fed by 40 gallons of ancient water per hour, did not fail. The grass there did not grow lush or tall in the summer of 1984. This was not a paradise. It was a dry pasture with adequate moisture at the root level, holding a thin but functional stand of blue grama and buffalo grass that maintained just enough to keep the steers in slow, steady gain through July and August. The concrete tank ran full each morning and was drawn down to half or 2/3 by evening and ran full again overnight. The steers were not fat animals. They were animals that were surviving well, which, in the summer of 1984 in Union County, New Mexico, was the same as thriving. By August, the North Canyon pasture was one of the few green parcels visible from the county road. It was not loudly green. It was the kind of green you notice only because everything around it is the color of old bone. Eulalia had taken to spending 4 or 5 days a week on the place, as there was always work, and she and Opaline had fallen into the quiet, economical rhythm of 2 people who communicate through the work itself and do not require the reassurance of constant talk. Eulalia had read the full journal by August and had opinions about several of its other observations, and had begun making her own notes in a separate notebook she kept in the barn. This fact pleased Opaline in a way she did not articulate. In early September, a cattle buyer from Springer named Gil Archuleta came through the county looking for steers to fill a contract. He had heard there was a woman on the east side of the mesa who had cattle still carrying condition, which struck him as implausible enough to be worth investigating. He drove to the Rourke place on a Tuesday morning and found Opaline mending fence on the south edge of the North Canyon pasture. He introduced himself and asked if he might look at the animals. She said he was welcome to look. He looked for a long time. He said, "These are not the same animals people said you bought in April." She said they were. He walked back along the fence line and looked at the pasture and the tank and the grass, and at the slight depression at the north edge where the buried line ran to the well. He said, "You have water." She said, "I do." He said, "Where?" She said, "From the rock." He stood with his hands in his pockets and looked at the brown country on every side of this one narrow rectangle of green, and he said, "What do you want for them?" She had a number ready. She told him. He did not negotiate. She sold 16 of the 19 steers to Gil Archuleta in the 3rd week of September 1984 for a price that, after her costs, returned her roughly 300% on the original $950 investment. She kept 3 back. She kept them because they were the 3 she had coaxed up the loading ramp in April with a rope, and she had made a private determination in April that those 3 were going to live out their natural term on the place that had brought them back. This was not a financial decision. It was the other kind. The drought did not break until the spring of 1986. In the 22 months between September 1984 and the first significant rainfall event of March 1986, Opaline restocked the North Canyon pasture twice with purchased animals, running small groups of 12 to 15 head at a time through the pasture, on a rotation that allowed the grass to rest and recover. She was not carrying large numbers. She was carrying the right number for what the land and the water could support, a figure she had arrived at by reading Clement Rourke's 1909 through 1913 observations and doing arithmetic that the modern range condition indices had not accounted for because the modern indices did not know the well existed. She cleared a modest operating surplus in each of the 2 years, enough to pay Eulalia's wages and maintain the improvements and send Martin and Clara each a short letter at Christmas saying that she was fine, the place was fine, and they should not worry. Harlan Fitch sold his cows in the fall of 1985. He did not have water and he did not have grass, and the market was punishing, and he sold into it because waiting was costing him more than selling. He kept his land, which was the important thing, but he walked off the cattle with the particular gait of a man who has made the only decision available and knows it was not the decision he wanted to make. He drove past the Rourke place on his way back from the sale barn, and the North Canyon pasture had 12 red steers in it, and they were, by any honest measure, doing well. He did not stop. Dennis Cordova came back in November of 1985. He came not in his official capacity, but on a Saturday, in his own truck, wearing his own clothes, and he knocked at the door of the adobe house and asked Opaline if she would be willing to show him what she had done. He said he had been thinking about it for a year. He said he had told her the wrong thing in May of 1984, professionally speaking, and he had been correct by every metric he had available, and incorrect in the final result, and he wanted to understand why. He said this with the difficulty of a man who respects his own training and has recently discovered it to have a gap in it, which is a more painful thing than discovering training that is simply wrong. Opaline showed him the well. She showed him the journal. She showed him Clement's 1909 notation and Earl's late 1960s follow-up, and her own calculations from the winter of 1983 and 1984. She showed him Eulalia's notebook. She walked him through the numbers on the pasture performance in every dry period since 1909. She did not say, you see. She did not say, I told you so. She did not arrange any of it for effect. She laid the record out in front of him the way a person lays out a map, because a map is useful, and the traveler is standing there, and he walked through it for 2 hours and asked careful questions and took notes in his own notebook. At the end of it, he said, the formation feeds from a catchment that is probably 3 or 4 miles north, and it would not appear on the standard surveys because no one has been looking for it. She said, that is what I believe as well. He was quiet for a moment. He said, are there others like it on this section? She said, Earl believed so. I have not found the second one yet. He asked if he could come back and help look. She said he was welcome. The rains came in March of 1986, when the drought officially broke, which is to say when the regional precipitation returned to something close to its 30-year average over a sustained period. The Rourke place was not in the condition of its neighbors. Its neighbors' ranges had been severely stressed, and in some cases had undergone vegetation shifts during the drought years, with annual weeds and bare soil patches replacing the perennial native grasses that take years to reestablish. These are the predictable consequences of carrying capacity collapse under extended drought, and they are not failures of character or management, but of circumstances that overwhelmed available resources. The Rourke North Canyon pasture had not undergone this shift. The native grass was intact at its root systems. The recovery rate in the spring of 1986, once moisture arrived, was faster in that pasture than in any adjacent ground, by a margin that Dennis Cordova documented in a field report he submitted to the Extension Service and later published in a regional range management journal. The report did not use Opaline's name. He had asked if she wanted it used, and she had said no, and he had respected that. The report described the subsurface water source, the historical record that identified it, the gravity-fed distribution system, and the stocking decisions derived from the historical data. It used the language of range science throughout. At the end of it, in his acknowledgments, he wrote, "This work was made possible by a detailed historical land record maintained across 2 generations by a family on private land in Union County, and by the insight to read it. That was all." Harlan Fitch came in April of 1986 to ask Opaline if she would walk his property with him and tell him what she saw. He had reread several times the brief description of the Rourke well that had circulated through the community by then, and he had thought about the North Canyon pasture's performance through 3 drought years, and he had arrived at his neighbor's door with the particular humility of a man who has been respectfully wrong for 2 years and has decided that the cost of remaining wrong is higher than the cost of admitting it. He said, "I think I may have something similar on my north section, and I don't know how to look for it." He said, "I should have asked you 2 years ago." He said, "I'm asking now." She put on her boots. They found evidence of a similar subsurface formation on the Fitch North section. That same afternoon, based on an anomalous grass pattern in a low area of the pasture. It was not as accessible as the Rourke well and would require a more significant excavation, but it was there. Opaline walked Harlan through the same observational methodology she had derived from Clement's journal: the grass tells, the rock-shelf relationships, the seasonal holdover patterns in dry years, the things a person could read from 30 years of morning notations if they were paying the right kind of attention. She gave him a copy of the relevant pages from the journal. She asked for nothing. In the following 2 years, working with Dennis Cordova's field assistants and the voluntary labor of several other ranching families in the area, 4 additional subsurface water sources were identified on properties in the eastern end of the county, all of them consistent with the fractured limestone formation that Cordova's report had documented. None of them were on surveys. 2 of them showed evidence of historical use consistent with pre-settlement or early settlement era construction. One had a hand-laid stone rim that a historical archaeologist from the University at Las Vegas dated to approximately the 1870s. None of the families who found them had known they were there. Eulalia Vasquez stayed on the Rourke place. She had by 1987 read the complete journal 6 times and had filled 2 notebooks of her own, extending the observational record forward with the same precision Earl had used, and with some additional categories he had not thought to track. She had a way with the animals and a native understanding of the land's behavior that Opaline recognized as the same quality she had recognized in Earl and in Clement's written observations, which is to say, a willingness to let the ground tell you what it knows, rather than telling the ground what you expect it to say. She was 27 years old in 1987. She had plans that involved staying. That autumn, a small plane chartered for a watershed survey flew over the eastern mesa. The photographer aboard was documenting range recovery rates across the county in the first full season after the drought's end. He shot roll after roll of uniform brown range with scattered green patches where the native perennial grasses were reestablishing in the recovering years. Then he came over the Rourke place. He shot the North Canyon pasture and the surrounding ground on 3 passes because, he said later, he thought at first his exposure was off. The green was too consistent. It looked wrong against the surrounding landscape. He had it developed and the print made and sent a copy to the extension office. Dennis Cordova pinned it to his office wall. It was Eulalia who eventually had the photograph framed after Opaline died in 1999 at 77 years of age, sitting in her kitchen at the table where she had read the journal through the winter of 1983. Eulalia had by then been running the place for several years in all practical respects, and she had by then trained 3 young people from the area in the observational methodology and had guided the identification of 2 more subsurface sources on adjacent properties, and had submitted Clement Rourke's original observations, reconstructed from Earle's transcriptions, to the historical archive at the county seat. She had written the inscription on the brass plate herself. She had written it in the plain, declarative voice of a person who has learned to report what the record says without addition or embellishment. The water was always there. You only had to trust something older than your own opinion. The Rourke place is still a working ranch. The North Canyon pasture still carries cattle every summer. The well, deepened and relined in 1991 with Cordova's assistance and a small conservation grant, still produces its steady flow of cold, clear water from the fractured limestone deep below the mesa. The journals are still there, Earle's followed by Eulalia's, on the shelf in the barn alongside a 3rd volume begun in 2003 by a young man from Capullin who came to the place looking for seasonal work and stayed. The grass on the North Canyon pasture comes green in the spring a full 2 weeks before the surrounding range. It has done this every year since Clement Rourke first noticed it and wrote it down in 1909 in the plain handwriting of a man with no reason to ornament the truth on a piece of paper that survived a house fire and 30 years and a drought and a widow's winter, and found its way, finally, to the hands of someone willing to believe it. The photograph hangs in the Watershed Council offices in Clayton. The small, dark figure at the center of the green has her face turned away from the plane. She was not interested in being seen. She was interested in the water.